So our topic was the evolution of dinosaurs to birds. And the origin of birds was first studied after Charles Darwin published his book in 1859 on the origin of species. And in this book he stated that all organisms have to evolve from a pre-existing one, that a sudden burst of evolution can't just produce new organisms. And so some scientists agreed with Darwin, but others did not. Others, like Richard Owen, believed that these small birds were, these big dinosaurs had too many complex features for these small birds to have evolved from them. He did not understand how you went from these huge dinosaurs to these small birds. And so, but others like Thomas Huxley agreed with Darwin and believed that with a small accumulations of changes over time and adaptations that this was possible. And so through the study of morphology and embryology and cladistics and fossil remains, scientists today do believe that birds evolved from dinosaurs. They believe that they evolved from an ancestral group of dinosaurs called theropods. And this is where the theropods begin, and the velociraptor is an example of a theropod. And it was the first bird-like dinosaur. It has wings and feathers, a few feathers of a bird, but it has the tail and the teeth and claws of a dinosaur. But the main thing was that these theropods had adapted a smaller size. These were smaller than these bigger dinosaurs. And this was a key feature because it's believed that 65 million years ago, an asteroid hit Earth and it wiped out many of the resources that were on the land. And it caused these bigger dinosaurs to go extinct because they were not able to give these resources anymore. And these theropods had this smaller size, and this was a great advantage for them because they can now go up in trees and find new ways to get new resources, and the smaller size was an advantage for them. And so over time, birds continue to evolve from these theropods and become smaller, and their features become more distinct. And so birds and theropods have shared derived characteristics that link the two and allow them to adapt. And so then in 1861 in Germany, paleontologists found a fossil, and this was a key fossil because it was a transition fossil. It was said to be of the late Jurassic age, and it was said to be 150 million years old. And this was the Archaeopteryx. And this is the Archaeopteryx fossil here. And this is the Archaeopteryx here. And this was the link that they had been looking for between dinosaurs and birds. And the Archaeopteryx has feathers and wings like modern birds, but it has the claws and the teeth and the tail of a dinosaur. So the feathers and the wings, paleontologists went back and excavated more fossils and found even some theropods before the Archaeopteryx had these wings and feathers as well. And so they came to believe after studying these fossils that the wings and the feathers were adaptations, and they did not first evolve for flight. They were adaptations for protection from predators and for insulation. And so they came to the conclusion that just like birds did not evolve from a sudden burst of evolution, these wings and feathers did not come about overnight. They were adaptations that were made over time, and they did not develop flight until much later as they became smaller and the features became more distinct.
So the question that we have is, how can we go from dinosaurs with these ginormous tails and these very sharp teeth to something as harmless as this nice little hummingbird that we have here on the bottom? And two of the key distinct factors that we've been talking about is the tail and the teeth. So we have a video here that I'm going to kind of show and talk about to see if it can be any distinct correlation between the two. That's not what I want. There we go. All right. This is an Albertosaurus, which is a relative of the T-Rex, and from hip to tail, the Albertosaurus has 35 vertebrae. When we get to the Archaeopteryx, which is this fossil, the Archaeopteryx has about 15 vertebrae, and by the time we get to the modern chicken, there are about 5 to 8 vertebrae just on the tip of the tail there, as you can see. Well, since the evolution of these birds happened so rapidly, we think that there are still the genes and the abilities of modern birds to grow these elongated tails, that perhaps these genes just shut off earlier now than they did back with dinosaurs. So what this scientist did is he analyzed embryos of chickens. And what he found was actually quite shocking. The embryo of a chicken at a day and a half old, as you can see here, has 16 vertebrae, which is the same number as the Archaeopteryx, actually one more. But by the time they're developed and are hatched, they are down to 5 and 8. So this is very puzzling. This is not really what he expected to see. You can see here that it almost looks dinosaur-like in this picture. So he decides to test it. And his hypothesis is that he will be able to grow an elongated tail in these chickens. So he takes this bead, and this bead contains proteins that would be created by the enzymes if the gene was stayed on longer in chickens. He places it on the end of this tail, and he observes a few days later. And what he finds is quite monumental, actually. What you see here, pause this right quick. The tail of the chicken is added about 5 to 8 vertebrae, just after adding onto this one gene these certain proteins. And perhaps even more special than adding the 5 to 8 vertebrae is the entire scaffolding is larger, as you can see, from left to right, not just lengthwise. And the second trait that we were talking about is the evolution of teeth and how they have changed. And these two scientists were analyzing feathers but they looked at the beak of these chicken embryos, and they saw these structures that appeared to be teeth in the beak. I believe it's going to show. It's kind of hard to see. There we are. Right in this area here, you can just see there are barely 3 little bumps. Right there, right there, right there. And so that was very peculiar to them. They didn't really know, like, what are these bumps doing? They look like teeth. So they decided to peel the beak away to analyze what they look like, and they began to question what are the living relatives of birds, and the closest living relative are alligators and crocodiles. And after peeling away the beak, we can see that the teeth of the chicken actually look a lot like crocodile teeth. So they decided to test this as well, and they found that by injecting a virus into the DNA of the chicken that contained enzymes that grow teeth in other animals, that they can actually grow teeth in a chicken, as we can see right here. This bottom row, you can clearly see that there are the formation of teeth on the beak of a completely normal chicken.
Right, feathers and other characteristics of birds emerged long before birds evolved, the evolution of birds. From this, we indicate that birds adapted from several pre-existing features and put them to a new use. Although scientists still are quite unsure of why exactly all of these characteristics evolved in the first place, they all are sure that through all of these examples that they do in fact come from dinosaurs. See here, dinosaurs originally had about 5 digits, and as it goes down, you can tell that the outer digits get smaller and eventually disappear. Once they get to the 3 inner digits, they actually become elongated and begin merging together, which form what we know today as wings. These wings were formed and we believe were used for several protection methods and eventually led to flight. Also, another characteristic that changed over time was the beak. As you can see, none of the dinosaurs really have beaks, But here you can see that they began to elongate their snouts and actually did in fact lead to beaks. And we don't have a figure up here, but the Yichi also has a beak. And we learned that they formed this due to a lack of meat food sources, and it helped them eat more vegetative food sources such as seeds. It also helped with the stability of the face and the jaw. It no longer bent or became disfigured whenever they had to eat harder things. This also helped later on in flight because it became lighter in the front, which allowed for a larger head and evened out their body. Another thing, as Thomas mentioned, was teeth. Birds today, most of them do not have teeth, and this came along also with the formation of the beak. Since the beak is hard enough and since they no longer need meat food sources, there isn't really a need for teeth themselves. The Yichi didn't have teeth, but it did have a beak, and it was kind of the between the birds and the Archaeopteryx. Also, as you can see, the size was a huge change from birds to dinosaurs. These dinosaurs are extremely huge, versus these are quite small compared to these, and birds are even smaller compared to the theropods, and a lot smaller at that. This helped a lot because the smaller the dinosaurs got, the more agile and quicker they were to get away from the larger dinosaurs. This also helped them find more shelter, which covered them from the meteor strikes, which allowed them to live a little bit longer than the larger dinosaurs. It also helps later on whenever they take flight. It helped them go into the air at a lighter weight. Also, a huge change, which had a lot of benefits, were the hollow bones. Scientists are still unsure exactly which or how many dinosaurs had hollow bones due to the fact that they decompose so quickly, but we do know that several of the dinosaurs do in fact have hollow bones, especially in the legs, which allowed them to run faster. Hollow bones helped distribute a lot more oxygen to the body itself, and they did this by whenever they inhaled, they got oxygen into the lungs and then into little air sacs, which then were distributed to the blood and the hollow bones and to the muscles, which they needed for several different things. Since they were endothermic animals, oxygen, they created heat through the breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen, which was very important for them, which allowed them to survive in several different temperatures. Also, another big thing were feathers. Feathers evolved a bit after the bigger dinosaurs. They didn't originally evolve for flight. They emerged for insulation, and they were a more branched feather, which helped a lot more with insulation than these feathers did. However, we didn't need these feathers back then because they didn't have wings for flight. Scientists found this through, they finally found pores in certain dinosaurs, which they didn't know before they had four feathers. And once they found this was a key characteristic that connected them to the Archaeopteryx and to the birds themselves. So if they had feathers, elongated or branch feathers for insulation, why did they need longer feathers? They evolved longer feathers to protect their young, mostly for the most part. They grew feathers along their arms and their, as we call now, wings, to protect their eggs, and not only that, to insulate their eggs. And from there, they grew even longer, and it helped for camouflage as well, to protect the eggs and themselves. And as they grew smaller, it eventually evolved for a mechanism of flight.
And here's just a quick depiction of a quick depiction of one depiction of the evolution of feathers could have been. We start here with this more single strand, and then we break off, evolved or selected for the longer and more insulation that we have here. Perhaps in number 2, it could be suggested that these may have been reproductive related. These animals, or the females, were selecting for the males that had certain characteristics in the longer feathers. We don't exactly know, since there's no real way to test this. And perhaps by tire 3, it would have been more of a natural selection through flight and having these longer, more brisk feathers that were more suitable to be in the air longer. And kind of going with this is the idea of flight itself. And thinking about flying, there was recently discovered a fossil in China, which is the Yiqi, which we have referenced a couple times. Probably need to make that full screen, that'd be nice. The Yiqi is obviously a relative to modern birds, but there's a lot of questions on where it fits in compared to the Archaeopteryx in the timeline of the other dinosaurs, which we'll get to in a minute. A couple important things to note about the Yiqi is it was a feathered bird. You can see here that it was more like the tire 1 in the feather evolution, more like strands, kind of like we see in young birds today after they first hatch. Another important thing to note is the long fingers that they have here, elongated fingers, and that they did not have feathers on their wings. It was more webbed, much like a bat would be today, which suggests that perhaps they were not flyers as much. And we're going to see in just a second, when they show the depiction of what it looked like, some more evidence as to why we don't think they were perhaps sufficient flyers. Here's a depiction of what it would look like. And a couple of things to point out here are, first of all, weight distribution. You can see that most of the weight is in the rear of this bird, and thus it would make it very likely to stall out in flight, so it's probably not a very sufficient flyer. Therefore, it's probably more of a glider. Second thing to note is this is kind of one of the first birds that we see that doesn't have a large claw on the end of the wing, much like we can see in the Archaeopteryx and these dinosaurs before that have the fingers on the end. The Yiqi does not have that. There's kind of an end here, but it's not really claw-like, perhaps suggesting that they were very bipedal animals, and that their wings were either for, like she said, protection of the young or flying, not so much as for grabbing things. Which brings us to the question of, did flight evolve from the ground up or from trees down? Now, granted, we're 150 million years removed from the origins of flight, and although birds are arbal today, we can't test that, so there's no real way to know. But the two really main hypotheses are that it was bipedal birds that would run along the ground and they would jump to try to get resources out of trees, and the individuals that had wings that were able to use their wings for thrust to jump higher were selected for. Legs to climb up trees and then glide down or glide to a branch that was otherwise inaccessible. But like I said, there's no real way of testing that, so that's not a question that we can answer.
Any questions?
So when did the theropods, what time period did they evolve?
It was like the end of the Cretaceous period, so it was like the end of the dinosaurs around that time. And this was like 65 million years ago, so it was around the time that that asteroid hit and wiped out many of the resources and made dinosaurs go extinct, that they began to evolve.
Okay, thank you.
So you said at one point that most birds don't have teeth. Are there birds with teeth?
Not that we know of.
Okay.
right now.
All right. I
Well,
wasn't
that
sure.
I mean,
depends on if you play with them
yeah.
or not. You can genetically modify them to have teeth, but not as of now.
Yeah.
Can't be done.
So how far did they let these things develop?
So they,
I
Did
do
you-
not know the
they
answer.
didn't let them hatch. It was in one of our
Yeah.
articles.
They didn't let them hatch?
Yeah.
Not branching into Jurassic Park yet?
So what else would you need to create a dino chicken? You can now create a longer tail. You can create teeth.
You
What
can
el-
take away the gene for the premaxillary bones to create a reptile-like face.
Okay.
However, there are certain characteristics like the meat eaters. That's something that is innate. That's not something that you can genetically modify. That is something that is already programmed in the DNA. So there are only certain limits that we can get to that we can't cross.
So they're not going to attack us and eat us?
Probably not. Probably still gonna be a chicken.
And at some point, you need to somehow manipulate the forearms, right, to get back to three digits. I don't know. Sounds like we're pretty close to having dino chicken. Do you want a dino chicken as a pet? You can have one. No? Maybe a little horse and a dino chicken? All right. Thank you.